Welcome to this edition of Diligence Inside America's Boardrooms. I'm TK Kerstetter, and I'll be your host for today's show. Today, we're going to be talking about, is your audit committee evolving as the business environment changes? And joining me to have this discussion is Scott Flynn, who's the Vice Chair of Audit with KPMG. Welcome, Scott.
Thank you, TK. It's great to be with you. Thanks for the invitation.
So it's a great topic. You and I both know that the audit committee is sort of the core or the foundation of, a board. And so we've seen a lot of regulatory mandates and company risks have been changing dramatically over the last couple of years. But we never on the show have talked about sort of the evolution of the audit committee and the skill sets that might be best suited to serve on today's audit committee. So we know that the audit committee has to have a financial expert as outlined in Sarbanes-Oxley.
Yeah.
And we know that with the NYSE and NASDAQ listing requirements, that there has to be at least 3 independent directors. But my question to you is, if you were putting together an all-star audit committee to meet the demands of today's companies, including ESG, cyber, et cetera, what skill sets would be inherent on your audit committee and why?
Yeah. Well, so TK, I would start with this. I would just say, table stakes would be financial reporting and controls literacy. At the end of the day, the audit committee is responsible for supervising the external and internal auditors, and the opinions we issue on the financial statements are around the financials and internal controls. So that to me is table stakes, which, you could infer from that prior public company experience, likely either as a CEO or a CFO or an auditor or something else, would be important. The other thing for me, I would look for knowledge of or experience with the company's specific industry. I think that that's incredibly helpful, or experience in adjacent industries. And I say that just because it's likely that those companies have been or are perhaps going through similar types of transformations. And as you think about, the things you talk about in a set of financials and that the audit committee deals with, things like risk factors, key judgments, anything that you have that's relevant from prior experience to thinking about those risk factors, those key judgments, to me, that's really important. And facing into similar types of business issues and risks. So things like supply chain, financing, human capital. You said it, ESG, cyber. Those types of similar experiences, I'd look for that as if I was thinking about adding somebody to my audit committee. The one thing I would say is I'd be wary of appointing to the audit committee directors with a really narrow set of skill sets who can't otherwise contribute to the board's broader discussion and oversight responsibility. So, like I said, we need to be thoughtful about those narrow issues, the cyber and the ESG. But I think broad experience with leadership, critical thinking, and decision making is really important. And you mentioned financial experts. I personally, I'm a believer that the more financial experts you can get on your audit committee, the better off you're going to be. And if you think about what that translates to from a personal trait standpoint, intellectual curiosity, clearly, we both know that the changing nature of regulations, technology, all of that requires a certain kind of a continuous learner mindset, professional skepticism, kind of a questioning mind, and values. To me, if having integrity and courage, those are the types of, if I was building an all-star audit committee member, TK, those would be the things that I would be looking for.
I know if I was the chair and I was the only financial expert, I would feel sort of lonely out there. So I certainly concur, and I've always encouraged everybody to have multiple financial experts, if nothing else, for succession, which we'll talk about in a second here. So you've been in this, field and business for a long time. You've sat in a lot of boardrooms. Do you have any strong feelings about what the term should be for the audit chair? I know it takes a while to learn the job, and I'm not sure that my goal would be to not have the best person that's available in the job, no matter what the term was. And the only thing that sort of gripes me a little bit is when I see companies that have like a very short term, like we're rotating every 2 years or every 3 years. That to me is just getting to the point where somebody's learning the job. But how do you feel?
Yeah. So number one, I totally agree with you. Give me the best possible candidate, the best available athlete for sure. Relative to term, TK, I certainly agree with you. I don't personally have a really strong view on a specific term, but I would say this, that, clearly the role itself is certainly increasingly demanding. And there's more and more that I see, at least in my experience, being put on audit committee agenda. So if, what I see a lot is that the audit committee becomes kind of the default when it's not clear which committee should be managing a certain company related risk. And because of that, I think there's maybe more so on the audit committee, a really meaningful learning curve to the chair role. So, and it can, as a result, then take a couple of years for audit committee chairs to fully grow into the role. So, for me, rotating on the chair on a fixed schedule, particularly one that you alluded to that would result in a really short tenure just for the sake of rotating, that doesn't seem optimal for me. So, if I think back on the discussions in the literature I've looked at, I certainly see it typically land in the range of 5 to 8 years. But I think it's facts and circumstances related for each individual company. And part of that needs to be, a really robust process around the audit committee chair and the board self-assessment. And that to me is by far the best mechanism to identify when a change is going to need to be made. So anyway, I'd just say there's flexibility and the risk you run with fixed term, I think, is that you introduce the possibility that you could be changing chairs during a crisis or a time of major transformation. And to me, that could really be problematic. The one thing I maybe just point to, just because I ran our board leadership center for a period of time, is there's an article going back a few years where there was analysis that said that 3 years on average is kind of the elapse of time before that this organization saw, at least before a person came on the board and then rotated into the audit committee chair role. So I'd argue that's pretty reflective of the preparation time that's required to step in and be an audit committee chair.
Yeah. So it's a good segue into my last question, which was, how should a board handle the audit committee chair succession to ensure a good transition on all fronts, including, a relationship with the inside and the outside auditors, and knowing that, that could be necessary at any time, if something, quote, were to happen to the audit chair.
Yeah. First I'd say it's a timely topic. I know this is your life and mine too. And there have been obviously a number of articles recently around kind of this notion of an impending wave of audit committee chair departures who are going to either hit retirement age or just looking to transition out of the role. So for me, I guess I would recommend that an audit committee think about lining up a potential successor with that desired skill set, that optimal skill set, at least 1 to 2 years in advance of the chair stepping down. Obviously boards generally have formal succession planning processes. So I would say, whatever that script says needs to be done, certainly needs to be done. And I would also say that in most cases, at least that I see, the successor is most often an individual that's already a member of the audit committee. And for my money, that has lent itself to the smoothest of transitions in the examples that I've seen. That said, TK, an internal successor, that may not always be possible, and in some cases it may not be optimal. So a skilled external successor, it's somebody that offers fresh insights and potentially experience from chairing the audit committee at a different company, but like I alluded to earlier, that maybe has similar risks or similar business issues that the board is specifically trying to get after. Regardless of whether that new audit committee chair is internal or external, I think focusing on, like I said, on the succession well in advance is important. So in the interactions I've had with audit committee chairs, a number of them have alluded to and talked about the value of their contemplated successor shadowing them for a period of time if he or she is new to the board. And I think the other thing, you contemplate is if you think about board recruitment and looking for a specific skill set, all those considerations are important. On internal versus external, one thing maybe I'd point out, there's an academic study recently done by Tennessee that I thought was interesting, and they investigated whether new audit committee chairs provide more effective monitoring of the financial reporting process when they have firm-specific knowledge. And what they found is that organizations are less likely to misstate their financial statements when new audit committee chairs previously served on the audit committee, and that the longer that they had served on the audit committee prior to taking over as chair had an even more dramatic impact. So, I think that timing is important, lead time is important. Certainly, from sitting in my chair, investing the time to ensure that the handoff and good protocols get established with interactions with, the lead audit partner from the external firm and the typically the vice president, senior vice president of internal audit, and establishing those really sound relationships and the kind of regular reporting cadences is critically important. And the last thing maybe I'd say is, if I think about the transition in is important, but personally, I like to see, I think it's a better practice to have the predecessor audit committee chair remain on the audit committee for, at least a year, given that the financial statements are historical looking. And I think it's just effective to have that person hang around for at least a year.
Yeah, I just want to put an emphasis on one of the things you mentioned, Scott, and that's in recruitment. You may not be thinking about it, but when you look across, and this is what good organizations do when they have a good chairman of the Nom-Gov committee that's looking at this mix, but it's at that point when you bring a new director in that you have to say, where can they serve? How can they serve the organization? They may be somebody with great comp experience. It could be the comp chair. But if you need, that's when you got to start thinking about, hey, who can chair committees in the future? And the other tip that I would say is, if you find the right person and you don't have an opening, expand your board by one, get a good person in. When somebody retires, just peel it back. There's always a way when you find the right person, to get in your organization. So just some friendly tips that I think might help in making sure that succession is the right person and at the right time. So, well, Scott, I want to thank you for taking the time and sort of filling us in with all your experience in this space. I appreciate it that you joined us this afternoon.
TK, thank you. Great to be with you, and I appreciate the opportunity to catch up.
And that will conclude this edition of Diligence Inside America's Boardrooms. We hope you enjoyed the show. We'll be back again next week when we take another look at a critical topic that'll help you be a better board member or committee member. So we'll see you then.